University in Pittsburgh. I came a long way to be here. I'm very excited. I graduated from Hobart and William Smith colleges in May of this past spring, where I studied writing and rhetoric and warfare, and the soldier experience, which I created for myself to study exactly what we've been talking about for a day and a half. So this is wonderful. And my research that I conducted at Hobart and William Smith relates directly to heroism. So I was very excited to just hear that talk. To give you a background of what I study before I go into the paper today, my overall interest is in communication, how we communicate with the military as a society, how we communicate for them, and how that is problematized and how we can improve it. My goal ultimately in an ideal world would be to improve the relationship between the military and society, which may only be possible in a utopia, but I can dream. The research that I've conducted on heroism came in two different ways. The first one, I conducted interviews with veterans and civilians, where I asked them how they define what a hero is, and where they see heroes in our society, and then I gave them options of heroes as identified by the dominant media, and asked them if those people were heroes and why. And the patterns that I saw were that people were they had very similar ideas of what a hero was, and then the classification of who was a hero by the media, or how they agreed with those portrayals, started to differ. The patterns weren't big enough to lead me to any big conclusions, but it did lead me to wonder where our idea and our definitions of heroes comes from, and how that may differ by population, which I think is really something that we should continue to think about in future research as we think about how we communicate with others, where our definitions of these concepts come from. My other project is on identity, which relates more specifically to what I'll be talking about today. So I looked at the hero identity and created a concept that I called the bestowed identity, where I argue that the hero identity is bestowed upon others in a way that is different than any other identity or most of the identities that we tend to look at. And so what that means is that the hero identity is not self-assigned. And by definition, if you self-assign your identity as a hero, it could be meaningless. So if I say I'm a hero, I could be, by definition, not a hero. But what happens in society is that we call people heroes, and they often resist that. So when you say, oh, you're a hero, thank you for your service, most of the time your response is, well, I'm not, but thank you. And what I found was that this bestowing of identity is really problematic because it limits the way we can talk to veterans and service members, and it also puts them in a box that they don't want to be in, at least by the people that I spoke to in these interviews. And so in thinking about that identity, what I do in this project is look at grievability and how that can relate to one's identity as well. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So my paper is called Bodies in War, Organic Shrapnel, Torture, and Grievability. Before we go into that, I do want to note that I'll be using the word torture. The methods that I'm talking about are often called enhanced interrogation methods. I'm choosing to use the word torture, both because it is used in other research, but also because I'm going to be looking specifically at the consequences of torture, and so to use the word that has more negative connotation seems to drive that point home. My paper is split into 3 sections, and that's how this presentation will be divided. I'm going to define what organic shrapnel is, because it's probably not something you've heard before. And then we'll talk about organic shrapnel and torture, and then that relationship as it relates to grievability. So the idea of organic shrapnel originates from a novel called Falling Man by Don DeLillo. He originally uses this concept as a way to capture the aftermath of a suicide bombing, where when the suicide bomber, when the suicide bomber's body explodes, it becomes part of the shrapnel of the bomb, and that becomes embedded in victims' bodies. And in this novel, what they found were victims were going to the doctor's offices with these odd bumps on their bodies, and they couldn't figure out what it was, and they found that it was organic matter that had become embedded within them in the aftermath of a suicide bombing. And this fascinated me because the idea of something being so organic becoming embedded in your body is incredibly intimate, and that goes against how we see war. We are often thinking of the violence of that, not thinking of the intimacy. And so I propose that organic shrapnel foregrounds this intimacy between the bodies of war, contamination, and vulnerability. Violence and organic shrapnel are closely related because inflicting violence on another person can result in the transference of blood, sweat, or tears from one individual to another. And the shrapnel may not always become embedded in the body. However, the organic shrapnel still results in a marking, physical or mental. So what I mean by that is that the organic shrapnel, as DeLillo said, it is embedded in the body. It's a physical, visible mark. But I expand this concept to think of how can we affect people mentally? How do we psychologically harm them? What are the psychological effects and physical effects that may not be visible on the body? And so in thinking about torture, this comes through in a couple of different ways. The case study that I used was Eric Fair's memoir, Consequence. Eric Fair is a U.S. Army veteran. He was also a contractor for the Army during the war in Iraq. He was sent both to Abu Ghraib and Fallujah. So he was a witness and a participant in torture. He gives us multiple examples of both torture that he used or he witnessed others using. For a physical example, physically beating somebody, having a torturee sit in a chair position with their back against the wall in a squat with heavy folders in their hands until they are no longer able to stand and they collapse. Mentally, throwing chairs at a wall in order to scare somebody, leaving somebody in a dark room and exposing them to light periodically. These are ways in which we aim to, or the torturee aims to psychologically harm somebody. And similarly, I argue that torturers, those doing the torturing, can also be affected by organic shrapnel. Physically, as I mentioned before, the blood, sweat, or tears from the torturee could be transferred onto the torturer's body, but mentally, they may also be affected by some of these methods. So the exposure of light, for instance, could also affect the torturer, but more perhaps importantly, the witnessing of others using torture can have psychological damage as well as the guilt. So what happens when you witness or you participate in these things and then have to move on from it? And that leads us to this idea of grievability. This comes from Judith Butler, who draws connections between grieving and vulnerability. She argues that there are conceptions that determine what counts as a livable life and a grievable death. And these conceptions determine what it means to be normatively human. Therefore, there are conceptions that define an individual as non-grievable. Their lives must not be grieved. And since there is a link between grievable deaths and livable lives, this means that their lives are not livable. And so what I argue in this paper is that the dominant perspective is that our service members as Americans are seen as having livable lives and thus grievable deaths, and those who are against us are seen as having the opposite. And so what happens when we use torture to this idea of grievability? Does it change our perspective? Does it upend that kind of dichotomy? And my argument is yes, it does. The use of torture on a non-grievable life, I argue, can increase their grievability. And I imagine this on a sort of spectrum. So it's not to say you are either grievable or non-grievable, but rather you can be kind of in fluctuation. And so if you are a victim of torture, you can become more grievable because of it. But more importantly, or what perhaps I should say I'm focusing on in this paper, is that service members can become less grievable, which is something in relation to this work on heroism that we don't want to talk about, because we don't want to see our service members as anything other than this hero myth. So Eric Fair, we can see this in his memoir. He wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times about torture where he didn't implicate himself. He doesn't talk about having participated in it personally, but he does talk about its use, the torture, during his service. And readers had a very strong negative reaction to it. One of the readers says in an email, "Mr. Fair, your words are empty and hollow. I do not accept a single one of them. But let me offer you a suggestion if you want to do the honorable thing. Kill yourself. Leave a note. Name names. Until that day, I hope you never sleep another hour for the rest of your life." And this suggests that even speaking out about this use of torture can decrease his grievability, that he is told to kill himself. He is not seen as having a livable life anymore because he's now speaking about something we don't we don't want to talk about. What I found interesting is that in this memoir, Fair seems to suggest that grievability is not definitive, rather it's a matter of perspective. So he receives a phone call from an Army Criminal Investigation Command agent, or a CID agent, who conveys that the Department of Justice wants to speak to him. And he goes to this meeting and he discloses all of his information, the things that he witnessed, the things that he did himself. And after doing so, he is not prosecuted, nor is anybody else who he mentions. And this is done because they tell him that they, quote, tortured people the right way, followed the right procedures, and used the approved techniques. So I argue that the lack of prosecution here suggests that the Department of Justice and the Army CID agent still saw Fair's life as grievable, even after he admitted to things that we can imagine if he had put in that the original op-ed piece, people would not have seen as acceptable. And I further would argue, although this is a place where I would love to see future research, that if this had been published, if the Department of Justice or the government itself had said, we see this life as grievable, even though it has participated in these ways, that the dominant perspective, that is the civilians who saw him as less grievable, that perspective may have been shifted because the government and the media have the possibility or have the agency to shape those perspectives. So I would like to conclude just by recapping that organic shrapnel, as I argue, is an intimacy that occurs between two bodies, whether or not it becomes embedded visibly in the skin, but it's a psychological or physical harm that lasts, and it can occur during or after acts of torture in this example, although that is by no means the only way that it occurs, and that this can affect the grievability of the torturee and the torturer. And I would like to just offer some ways in which I think this research could be expanded or useful to others, in that it could be helpful in the psychological treatment of our service members and veterans, especially those who are having to overcome guilt such as these, and thinking about the ways in which that affects their grievability, as well as in communication studies and thinking of strategies such as my own work and how we can think about how grievability affects that communication. Thank you.
My name is Swati. I'm a PhD student who is waiting for her thesis defense. So what I'm doing here today is a short concept that I'm trying to introduce to you today. It's called traumatizability, and my paper is titled Traumatizability in the Age of Counterterrorism. I'm just going to read this out here. With the onslaught of counter-terror measures after 9/11, the contemporary period, I argue, is also witness to traumatizability. Traumatizability, the concept and neologism, lies in the capacity of the subject to be allocated as the bearer of trauma. Traumatizability ensues the ability of the subject to be considered traumatized. Traumatizability, thus, is not a descriptor of who has suffered and who has not. Rather, it acts as a sieve. It filters the suffering of which subject gets recognized as traumatic and which suffering is relegated to other registers of hurt or is not registered at all. My context, most specifically, is about the period after 9/11 and the Bush presidency's counter-terror methods in particular. To be even more specific, I work with the phenomena which leads to the creation and sustenance of sites of incarceration, such as Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. This paper is about exploring the connection between traumatizability and, as the paper before me introduced, what Judith Butler calls grievability. This paper is also about traumatizability as an underlying state-sanctioned condition for the category of the human. To proceed, I first gesture towards the category of trauma itself. While the roots of the word trauma might reside in the Greek for wound, I wish instead to briefly regard one particular hybrid assemblage, as Roger Luckhurst has called it, um, in the genealogy of the category itself. In particular, the 19th century notion of the railway spine as amongst the earliest known versions of trauma is of interest to me. Railway spine, which was considered as a jolt to the spine produced in the aftermath of railway accidents, left people with nervous symptoms without any previously recognized etiology. Railway spine has been read as a symbol for the shock of modernity itself. The notion was coupled with the demand for monetary compensation on railway companies by passengers suffering from the malaise. Needless to say, the great capitalist enterprise of Britain sought containment. There was engendered another discourse on trauma, that of Herbert Page's nervous shock, which stated that the cause of the belated emotional outburst could not in any tangible medical way be linked to the railway accident. In the medical legal assemblage that followed, the discursive product of the physician's carefully studied facts put insurance companies against the simple word of the patient seeking compensation in court. I mention this as a genealogical precursor to comment on certain aspects of trauma in the age of counterterrorism. First, trauma is discourse which sought to be managed as a knot by linking it with other state-controlled discourses, law, medicine, and commerce in the form of rights. Second, even within the field of production of trauma thoughts, there are multiple forms that trauma could take. The trauma of the railway spine, the notion about a physiological jolt to the spine was in stark contrast to the notion of nervous shock, the notion that the nervous symptoms were not physiologically related to the accident. Third, due to a link with commerce and law, trauma, or rather the bearer of trauma, was seen as subject to a medical juridical decision. This medical juridical decision sought to mark the border between those who were seen as suffering, or rather as traumatized, and those who were seemingly malingering for insurance claims. Simply put, the court decided whose suffering counted as worthy of suffering and whose did not. Fourth, the discourse on railway spine seemed to follow an Orwellian dictum. All traumas were equal, but some traumas were more equal than others. The dictum was actualized by the very act of seeking compensation, a process that the working class, for instance, traveling in the same train by third class could not be privy to. In Thomas Lacker's opinion, trauma became a function of one's class. By the time we proceed to the late 20th and the 21st century, so my tangential going into the 19th century does have some link to what I'm trying to say. So with the onslaught of 9/11, trauma became a dominant signifier in Andreas Hussein's words, and had become so entrenched that we seem to be living under, in Parson and Richmond's words, under an empire of trauma. I simply gestured towards the Peruvian circle of trauma theory and its impact on, from the 1980s onwards, coupled with the Yale School of Reconstruction and their continuing popularity. Apart from Kathy Caruth, the names Shoshana Feldman, Dory Lobb, Claude Lanzmann, Paul Deman, Jeffrey Hartman, Harold Bloom, among others, is of relevance here. While it is beyond the scope of my paper right now to elaborate on trauma theory per se, I will, however, mention one of those trauma theorists, and his work on collective trauma. Collective trauma, Erikson implies, is a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damage the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of communality. Yet simultaneously, those traumatized are drawn to other traumatized people, such that trauma functions as the basis for communality. While Erikson's focus is not on 9/11, several others have used the notion of trauma as wound to the social fabric at the onset of 9/11. Thus, Richard among others, can read the trauma of 9/11 as centered on the rupture of notions of fantasies of inviolability of an innocent homeland. And so Mark Redfield can state that 9/11 trauma gains culturally traumatic status, this is the quote, a symbolic act of violence on the social fabric. And that US President Bush and his counter-terror measures can bring forth an imagined community, to use Benedict Anderson's phrase, or rather an imagined homeland into being that is also regarded as traumatized. There is thus created a state-sanctioned collective of subjects traumatized. The so-called communality has its basis the notion of a traumatic wound, that of 9/11. Bush states that on the atrocity, that the events of the atrocity, quote, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. Each of the emotions mentioned points to post-traumatic stress, such that the atrocity and trauma of a community, New Yorkers and Americans, is hijacked by the state to allow the trauma metaphor to act as a mode of addressing and dressing the 9/11 wound. The manner in which the state of USA uses the mechanism of 9/11 to inaugurate a new form of authoritarianism has already been established by thinkers such as Giorgio Agamben. For Agamben, the United States becomes a state of exception, which uses the atrocity to declare a state of emergency. While this emergency was earlier marginal, it has, after 9/11, according to Agamben, become normativized. The state makes use of its emergency powers to create a culture of fear, and more importantly, of trauma, to interpolate and bring to actuality a collective of traumatized peoples and a nation. Thus, Bush can state, this is a paraphrase, but he can state that 9/11 functions as a dividing line between the lives of its nation and people. The nation and its people are both seen as being traumatized, with 9/11 acting as the site of the wound. The fact that this is trauma at home intensifies the trauma. Yet, even here, certain similar features which are found, which are similar to the discourse on grave is fine. First, trauma functions as a hybrid assemblage. Psychologists, psychiatrists form part of the medical care response in the immediate aftermath. Insurance claims later, along with more obvious police and firefighting units, also function as different assemblages. Thus, law, police, medicine, and commerce are various intersecting forces. Second, with the insurance claims, it is common knowledge that certain sufferers belonging to certain zip codes were seen as traumatized, while certain others were not. Trauma became a function of the proximity to the disaster rather than a matter of fact. Trauma was also seen as valid only if it was validated by certain of these discourses. Trauma was thus relegated to a mode of decidability. I now switch to context to a few years later, where war and incarceration in war are both an actuality. The prisoners at Guantanamo have been regarded as collateral damage of counter-terrorist measures, at best by sympathizers and anti-war protesters. The so-called terrorist prisoner has been literally picked up from places such as Iraq and Afghanistan through bounty seekers or warlords, sold to the US military, from where he, and it is always a he, lands at sites of incarceration such as Guantanamo. There have been several reports of torture, and I agree with the claim that we need to use the word torture, and violation of legal rights of the prisoner. The rules of engagement for prisoners of war, for instance, has not been invoked. Instead, the legalese insists on calling the prisoner a detainee to suspend international conventions and sanctioning torture. There has been a movement to bring these prisoners to justice in terms of providing them with basic legal rights and subsequent freedom. The discourse relevant here has not been of trauma, as with New York victims of 9/11. The discourse, rather, has been of human rights violations, among others. The work done by the Center for Constitutional Rights is but one example of this discourse. The theorist Lynn Hunt states how human rights discourse consists of a paradox. The human in human rights is seen as a pre-given, pre-assumed. In other words, human rights violations occur when the human in human rights is not considered a self-evident category, when that humanity is not recognized. Judith Butler comments on the notion of lives as collateral damage and how certain modes of state regulation of violence imply, in her words, quote, that specific lives cannot be apprehended as injured or lost they are not first apprehended as living. This is frames of word. For her, grievability resides in the process where lives can be mourned as lives lost. If mourning implies a loss or a trauma, thus grievability and mourning of trauma can be shown to be connected. For Butler, it is life's physicality that brings everyone into the ambit of the grievable. The notion of humanity can be shown to be expanded based on life, every life's physicality. It persists with the notion that for the United States, some humans count as humans and some do not. Some lives are grievable, some are not. Similarly, as discussed earlier, trauma and the ability of its bearer is connected with the notion of mourning grievability. Thus, if the grievable is the human and the traumatizable is the grievable, the traumatizable is also the human. A subject's traumatizability is connected to the recognition of his or her humanity by the state. This ritual of recognition is differential and discriminatory as evident by the differential treatment meted to some state subjects considered part of the state and other state subjects not considered part of the state. For example, American Muslims. These non-citizens, so to speak, are thus othered and expelled from the political community on the basis of their non-traumatizability and their lack of humanity in the eyes of the state. The task of human rights discourse thus becomes one where the human is sought to be reinscribed into the subject to allow them to reclaim their humanity and address their suffering as valid. Thank you.